The suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek was an idyllic place. Quiet streets, well-manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors who always exchanged polite greetings. The residents communicated through a community chat on WhatsApp, where they discussed everything from garbage pickup schedules to suspicious activity in the area. At 9 p.m., the chat was active, buzzing with casual conversations. Emily Parker, a 28-year-old software developer, had moved in only a month ago. She found the chat useful for keeping up with local happenings. Jake Thompson, a 35-year-old former military officer, was the self-appointed security watchdog of Willow Creek. He often checked his security cameras and shared updates about unusual occurrences. Mrs. Wilson, a 60-year-old widow, had lived in the neighborhood for over 3 decades. She knew everyone and never hesitated to call out anything suspicious. Tyler Jones, a 19-year-old college student, worked at a local diner and often used the chat for lighthearted jokes. Mr. Graves was a mysterious figure. He rarely spoke in the chat, and no one had ever seen him in person. His messages were infrequent, often cryptic, and unsettling. 9:15 p.m. The first message. Emily sent a message. Emily. Hey guys, I just heard footsteps outside my window. It sounded like someone was standing there for a few seconds. A few people read it but didn't respond immediately. Then Mrs. Wilson replied, Mrs. Wilson, my dog has been barking at the front door for the past 10 minutes. He never does that unless someone is out there. Jake checked his cameras and responded, Jake, I just checked my feed. There was someone near Emily's house, but they're gone now. Could have been a passerby. Tyler, relax, people. It's probably just a lost delivery guy or some kid messing around. Then, for the first time in weeks, Mr. Graves sent a message. Mr. Graves, number. It's not. A chill ran through the group chat. 9:30 p.m., the second warning. Emily felt uneasy. She locked her doors and checked the windows. Nothing seemed out of place. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilson's dog was still growling. Mrs. Wilson, I don't like this. My dog won't stop staring at the door. Jake sent a photo from his security footage. It showed a shadowy figure standing near Emily's house. But the strange thing was the figure had no distinct features. No face. No details. Just a dark outline. Emily. That's seriously freaking me out. Should I call the police? Jake. I would, but I checked my logs. The figure never actually moved. It just disappeared. Then a new message from Mr. Graves appeared. Mr. Graves. Some things don't need to move to get closer. Silence in the chat. 9:45 p.m. The first disappearance. Emily tried to distract herself with work. She put her phone down, but a loud knock at the door made her jump. She grabbed her phone and typed quickly. Emily, someone's knocking on my door, but when I check the peephole, there's no one there. No response. Emily, guys? Nothing. Then her last message appeared. Emily, it's inside. Her profile went offline. Mrs. Wilson. Emily, are you okay? No answer. Then Emily's contact disappeared from the group, not just offline, completely removed from the chat. Tyler. Okay, is this some kind of joke? Jake, I'm going over there. Then Mr. Graves sent another message. Mr. Graves. Number. You're not. And Jake's phone screen went black. 9:50 p.m. Silence in the chat. Emily was gone. Her messages, her presence in the chat, completely erased. Mrs. Wilson, gripping her phone tightly, tried calling Emily's number, straight to voicemail. Mrs. Wilson. Something is very wrong. Someone go check on her. Jake. I'm outside her house, lights are on, but no answer. Tyler. Dude, I don't think you should be there. What if it's still inside? Jake ignored the warning. He knocked on the door, waited, then turned the knob. It was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly. 9:55 p.m. Inside Emily's house. Jake stepped inside cautiously. The living room looked normal. A laptop hummed softly on the desk. A steaming cup of tea sat untouched on the counter. It was like she had just been there a moment ago. Then he saw it. The front door hadn't been forced open. No broken locks. No sign of struggle. Emily had let it in. Jake moved towards the bedroom. The door was ajar. The bed was neatly made, but the closet door was slightly open, revealing complete darkness inside. He took a deep breath and reached for it. Just as his fingers touched the handle, bzzzt. His phone screen flickered violently and a new message appeared in the chat. Mr. Graves, told you not to go inside. Jake's phone shut off completely. The room fell into complete silence. Then, a slow creak behind him. Something was in the room. 10 p.m., the second disappearance. Mrs. Wilson and Tyler waited for Jake to respond. Tyler. Jake? No answer. Mrs. Wilson. I don't like this. I really don't like this. Then Jake's last message appeared. Jake, it's real. And just like Emily, Jake disappeared from the chat. Mrs. Wilson. Oh my God, what is happening? Tyler was typing, but suddenly stopped. A new message appeared. Mr. Graves. 2 down. The chat fell silent. 10:05 p.m. A growing panic. Mrs. Wilson's hands trembled as she reread the messages. First Emily, now Jake. Their numbers were gone from the chat, as if they had never existed. Mrs. Wilson. Someone call the police. Tyler. I tried. My phone won't dial out, no data, no Wi-Fi. It's like something is blocking it. Mrs. Wilson grabbed her landline and dialed 911. The call went through. 911, what's your emergency? She exhaled in relief. I need help. Something is happening in my neighborhood. People are disappearing. The operator was silent for a second. Then a voice came through. Mrs. Wilson. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, distorted, crawling with static. You shouldn't have called. The line went dead. The hairs on her arms rose. A new message appeared in the chat. Mr. Graves. I warned you. 10:10 p.m. Outside in the darkness. Tyler paced in his apartment, clutching his phone. He tried texting his friend from another app. No signal. He peeked through the blinds. The street was eerily quiet. No cars, no movement. Then he saw something. Across the street, a figure stood completely still in front of Jake's house. It was tall and impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, it just watched. Tyler whispered to himself, Nope, 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 nope. A new message from Mr. Graves appeared. Mr. Graves. It sees you too, Tyler. Tyler's breath hitched. The figure slowly turned its head toward his window. 10:15 p.m., the third disappearance. Tyler backed away from the window, heart pounding. He grabbed a baseball bat. Tyler. Guys, I think something is outside. No response. He grabbed his car keys, deciding to run for it. But as he reached the door, thump. A slow, heavy knock. He froze. Another knock. Louder. His phone vibrated. A message from Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves. Open the door, Tyler. He held his breath, staring at the knob. Then, his phone screen flickered violently. Tyler's final message appeared in the chat. Tyler. Oh God, it's inside. Then, he was gone. Just like Emily. Just like Jake. Mrs. Wilson sat alone in the chat. A new message appeared. Mr. Graves. Only one left. 10:20 p.m., alone in the chat. Mrs. Wilson was the only one left. Emily, gone. Jake, gone. Tyler, gone. And now she sat in her dimly lit living room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The chat was silent except for one other person, Mr. Graves. Her breathing was uneven. She opened the contact list. Only 2 names remained, Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Graves. Everyone else had been erased. Then a new message appeared. Mr. Graves. You always liked watching, didn't you, Mrs. Wilson? Her heart pounded. Mrs. Wilson. Who are you? The typing indicator appeared. Then, Mr. Graves. I've been here longer than you, watching all of you, and now, it's your turn." She covered her mouth to stifle a scream. 10:25 p.m. The reflection in the glass. Mrs. Wilson forced herself to move. She locked the doors, shut all the curtains, and turned off every light. She grabbed the fireplace poker and stood in the dark, waiting. Her phone vibrated. "Mr. Graves." "Hiding won't help." Her hands trembled. She typed back. "Mrs. Wilson." "What do you want?" "Mr. Graves." "To finish what I started." Then she heard it, a faint creak, coming from the hallway mirror. She turned her head slowly. Her reflection was smiling. She wasn't. 10:30 p.m., the last disappearance. Mrs. Wilson's reflection took a step forward. She did not. Her phone vibrated violently in her hand. "Mr. Graves. Look closer." Her reflection whispered, "Come closer." She dropped her phone. It landed face up on the floor. The chat blinked out. Only one message remained. "Mrs. Wilson has left the conversation." The next morning, 7 a.m. Willow Creek looked the same as it always had. The lawns were neatly trimmed, the sun rose over the rooftops, and the streetlights flickered off one by one. Yet something was wrong. The entire neighborhood was silent. There were no sounds of morning coffee being brewed, no joggers, no children playing. And most disturbingly, there was no movement behind the windows. Every house seemed abandoned. The chat was still open, but it contained only one member, Mr. Graves. 7:10 a.m., the delivery man. A young delivery driver parked his truck in front of the complex. He checked his phone, confused. He had 4 scheduled deliveries, but no one was responding to their doorbells. "Hello?" He knocked on a few doors. No answer. He peeked through a window. Inside, a table was set for breakfast. A cup of coffee sat steaming next to a plate of eggs, but there was no one in the house. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Unknown. "Don't go inside." His stomach twisted. He turned back toward his truck. And then, he saw them. Figures standing in every doorway of the street. They weren't moving, just watching. 7:15 a.m., the driver's last delivery. The delivery driver, Mark, swallowed hard. The figures in the doorways stood completely still, their silhouettes barely visible in the morning light. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, hoping to call 911. No signal. The chat app on his phone opened by itself. There was only one message. "Mr. Graves, turn around. Leave. Now." Mark's breath hitched. He didn't type back. Instead, he took slow steps toward his truck, forcing himself to remain calm. The figures tilted their heads in unison. Then, they took a single step forward. Mark bolted for his truck. He slammed the door, turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. His phone buzzed again. "Mr. Graves, you should have listened." The figures moved, straight toward him. 7:20 a.m. A final message. Mark pounded on the steering wheel, desperately trying to start the engine. The figures were closer now. He could see their faces, or rather the lack of them. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth, featureless skin. His breath hitched. His phone vibrated violently. A video file appeared on his screen. His hands shook as he tapped it open. It was live footage from inside his truck. Someone was sitting in the passenger seat. He turned his head slowly. A faceless figure was next to him, watching. The screen of his phone glitched violently, and then the screen went black. 8 a.m., no sign of life. A police cruiser rolled into Willow Creek. Officer Daniel Cooper glanced at his radio, frowning at the silence. The station had received no calls, no complaints, nothing from this town since the previous night. That was impossible. He pulled over, stepping out onto the quiet street. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The neighborhood looked pristine. Cars were parked in driveways, newspapers sat on doorsteps, and yet there were no people, no kids, No joggers. Not a single door was open. 8:05 a.m. The truck. Then, he spotted it. A delivery truck abandoned in the middle of the road, its door hanging open. No sign of the driver. He approached cautiously, resting his hand on his holster. Inside the truck, he saw something that made his stomach turn. A phone sat in the driver's seat, its screen still flickering. It was open to a chat. Only one name remained. Mr. Graves. Then the phone screen changed. A message appeared. Mr. Graves. Welcome, Officer Cooper. 8:10 a.m. A growing fear, officer. Cooper felt his pulse quicken. The eerie stillness of Willow Creek made his skin crawl. The delivery truck was empty. The keys were in the ignition, the engine was off, and the driver's seatbelt was unfastened, as if the driver had simply vanished mid-route. The phone in the seat buzzed. A new message appeared. Mr. Graves. You're here now. His hands clenched. This was a prank. Had to be. He picked up the phone, swiping through the chat. But there were no messages from other people. Only Mr. Graves. Only one-sided conversations. No Emily, no Jake, no Tyler, no one at all. He turned toward the houses. If someone was playing games, he'd find them. 8:15 a.m. The empty houses. He knocked on the first door. No answer. He tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, everything was in place. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched on the table. A TV remote rested on the couch, a paused screen flickering. A child's toy lay in the middle of the carpet. Yet, the house was empty, like everyone had just stopped existing. He backed away, stepping outside. Across the street, a curtain moved. Someone was watching. His phone buzzed again. Mr. Graves. Don't look too close, officer. His blood ran cold. 8:30 a.m., nowhere to run. Officer Cooper stepped outside, heart pounding. The neighborhood was still eerily silent. The curtain across the street had moved. Someone, or something, had been watching him. His instincts screamed at him to leave. He reached for his radio. Static. His phone? No signal. Then, from behind, footsteps. He turned sharply, hand hovering over his gun. Nothing. But when he glanced toward the row of houses, his blood turned to ice. Every doorway was now occupied. Dozens of figures stood in the thresholds, motionless, faceless, watching. And then, in perfect unison, they tilted their heads. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A single message. Mr. Graves. Run. 8:35 a.m. Nowhere left to hide. Cooper ran. Through the empty streets, past the lifeless homes, past the watching figures. They didn't chase him. They just stood there, as if they knew there was nowhere to go. His car was still parked at the edge of the neighborhood. He yanked open the door, fumbling for the keys. The engine sputtered. A shadow fell over his windshield. He looked up. A figure stood directly in front of his car. No face, no eyes. Just a phone in its hand, screen glowing. His own reflection stared back at him. And then, darkness. 8:40 a.m., the chat that never ends somewhere. A phone screen flickered to life. The group chat reappeared, filling with messages as if nothing had ever happened. Emily was back, Jake was back, Tyler was back, even Mrs. Wilson. All of them typing. But their messages weren't the same. Emily, where am I? Jake, it's so dark here. Tyler, I can't move. Mrs. Wilson, please help me. A new message appeared. Mr. Graves, you are home now. Then, the last name in the chat was added. Officer Cooper, a blinking cursor, waiting. And then, a single message appeared from his account. Officer Cooper, I see you.